So, welcome to the second session of our paper 4 lectures. I decided this year to start us off with looking at the two set texts for paper 4 in sequence to put next to each other a localization in terms of time, space, structure, and language of these two texts. On the one hand, to show distinct features of Middle High German versus Early New High German. On the other hand, to show how messy actually the distinction is between the two linguistic periods, how much overlap there is, because as we looked last session at Helmbrecht, we saw Helmbrecht in the version of the Ambraser Heldenbuch written 1504 to 1515, so less than a generation before in 1530 Martin Luther published the Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen. So Helmbrecht would have been a text which Luther could have read in as entertainment literature, and we have really to think about these texts as a part of a wider communication circulating in different forms, influencing each other, and interlinking across a language and space. And then in the following next session, so in week 6 and week 8, we'll look at two of the topics from the later part of paper 4, which also come in today. The one is forms of address, how the early New High period is formative in differentiating hierarchical levels of addressing people. And Malena Ratzke is currently here on a Humboldt Fellowship, will show that at a very entertaining text which has come up previously in paper 3 examinations, namely the Rollwagenbüchlein by Georg or Jörg Wickram. And then we'll jump temporarily into the 20th and 21st century with a very topical lecture by Professor Henk de Berg from Sheffield, who is publishing in Times for the American primaries a comparative study in lying, he calls it, and that even though I wouldn't call language of the Reformation language of totalitarianism, there are certain rhetorical features of defamation, for example, of the rhetoric of attack that we will be able to see even in the Sendbrief today. So that's the kind of rationale behind the very short lecture series this term. So now to come to time, space, structure, and language for the Sendbrief. Helmbrecht, you will recall, is written some point in the 13th century. We had seen the dates. But the first manuscripts are much later, and that is partly because writing material is costly, expensive, and you recycle everything you can get hold of. If you look at the Handschriftenzensus, most of the manuscripts surviving from the 13th, 14th century are fragments or recycled palimpsests. And some people have argued that really the early modern period starts with the availability of paper. paper made from rags started to be produced in large numbers in Italy in the mid-14th century, and then crosses the Alps to the first paper mill being set up in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Town Council, which will play a role in the Sendbrief in a moment, set up an export ban on old clothes, rags, because there soon became a scarcity to feed the ever-growing hunger for paper made from rags. Particularly underwear is perfect for making the finest form of linen. And that was the precondition for the revolution of the printing press with typesetting, so recomposable texts being able to become a success story, because if you don't have stuff to print on, it doesn't matter how effective your printing techniques are. And so Luther is in a way the first generation of proper print natives, because it takes about 30 years from 1450 to 1480 for printing to break even. Until then, it's still cheaper to copy a text by hand, and the majority actually of surviving medieval manuscripts are copies made from printed texts from the late 15th century. But from about 1480, it is more effective to print in the first instance. Luther is born 1483. So it's a bit as with you as the first proper digital natives, having grown up not just with the technical means, but also the means of communicating it, be it now via social media or then via short, impactful statements, such as just a single broadsheet folded twice. The Mönchkalb that we launched last year is an example of that. And this coincides with the historical developments of a growing literacy, especially in the cities. So paper like Hans Sachs, being a cobbler, having attended a Latin school. So the education goes down through the middle classes, lower middle classes even, having a chance to learn reading and writing for the purposes of business, bookkeeping, developments. This is particularly put to good use for religious reform movements in the church. And despite of how Luther presents himself as, here I am, the new man, it's very much building on the earlier waves of trying to reform the church that he can be so successful. So the translation situation in Luther's time for the Bible is fairly complex, because pretty much up to a few years before Luther starts translating, the way in which you could approach the Bible was through the Latin translation of Jerome, who translated in the 4th century, standardizing regional circulating variations of the Bible. And in many ways, if you want to make an interesting compare and contrast situation, his Jerome's prefaces to his Bible translation, easily available in translation, make a fascinating read alongside Luther's Sendbrief, because they have to deal with the same criticism of the way they translate. So Jerome invokes the example of Cicero and says you have to translate like an orator is translating, basically not translating but interpreting in a way that it speaks directly to your audience. So Luther picks up translation arguments for the Bible that had been around and had been copied together with Jerome's Latin translation throughout the Middle Ages. And he picks up an argument that Jerome puts forward, which is also the humanist cry ad fontes, to the sources, back at the Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth that Jerome tried to establish, circumventing the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible by going back directly to the Hebrew Bible. And so this is a repetition of now circumnavigating Jerome, circumnavigating the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible and going back directly to the source text. And for the New Testament, directly to the Greek New Testament. And that was only possible because of the philological work by Erasmus von Rotterdam, who had revised the Greek New Testament and crucially issued it in a new bilingual study version with a new Latin translation of his revised Greek text. So a bit like your red, orange Reclam editions with critical notes to establish that. And without that, Luther's Greek wouldn't have been up to scratch, really, to translate. So there are a lot of factors, technical and philological, way before Martin Luther could start his way of translation. And you can see really how his way of tackling biblical texts changes after Erasmus' edition, because Luther had translated or dealt with the Bible before as professor of biblical literature in Wittenberg, but he had still been using the Latin Vulgate, so Jerome's translation. And when he is on the Wartburg, kind of rusticating from Wittenberg, since for his own good he was kidnapped by the Duke to take him out of trouble. The only book he had with him was this Erasmus bilingual edition of the New Testament. And in a way, this process repeats in 1530, when there is the Diet at Augsburg going on, and it's considered too dangerous for Luther to go there for himself. So instead, Melanchthon, who was of a much more compromising, ironic character and not in the direct shooting line, went to defend the Protestant cause, and Luther ended up on a castle again, this time on the Coburg, and was trying to influence the discussions going on at the Diet through his letter writing. The form of a Sendbrief is perhaps closest to a letter to the editors for a newspaper. So it's using the form of a letter and the personal tone that you can use with that to reach a wider audience, but in a much more colloquial style than a scholastic treatise would do. So if you compare it with the 1520 edition of Von der Freiheit eines Christenmenschen, where Luther starts with a thesis, an antithesis, ein Christenmensch ist freier Herr aller Dinge und niemandem untertan, and then the opposite, a Christenmensch ist jedermann untertan. So he uses a kind of academic formula of argumentation. He can attack his opponents in between, but he has to do it in a much more academic style. And also, so he would write texts like Von der Freiheit eines Christenmenschen, or would draft them first in Latin and then work them out in German. So even though the German appeared first, it still has his kind of Latin essay plan behind it. And that's different now with the Sendbrief. This is something conceived in German and not as an academic argument. And it goes hand in hand with his attempts to further the translation of the Old Testament, which he had started as soon as the New Testament had been published, but which he could only properly do surrounded by a group of colleagues in Wittenberg, because it's much longer, B, it's much more complex, since the Hebrew Bible encompasses texts written from several hundreds BC up to the 2nd century BC in bits containing very old Hebrew. So the language changes throughout the text. It has a lot of technical language. So it's reported that Luther went to a Jewish butcher just to get the names for all the parts of an animal right, that to get into all the Torah laws of how to ritually slaughter an animal. Or he had to consult people in the building industry for all the technical how to build a temple. So it's a much more complex undertaking. It needed the new Hebrew dictionaries developed at that period, and there wasn't this one tome in Hebrew. So he just took parts of the Old Testament for revision with him on the Coburg to linguistically then work through it. And the full Bible only came out in 1534. A kind of fun anecdote is that pirated copies of the full Bible, including the Apocrypha, appeared before the Wittenberg printers had published it, because Luther had first decided not to translate books like the Book of Judith, which he didn't consider canonical, since his whole concept of the Bible was to translate it starting from the center, die Mitte der Schrift. So he saw Christ as the focal point of Scripture. So anything that was as close as possible to Christ. So the Pauline letters, which were written as a direct response to Christ, at the center. Then at the further books like the Apocalypse, and then of the Hebrew Bible, first the Torah as the foundation for the New Testament, and the prophets as prophesying the New Testament, and other books going further and further away from this, and the Apocrypha, so the books that weren't part of the canonical Hebrew Bible, very much in the margins. But people were used to having the Apocrypha as part of the Bible. So canny printers in Cologne and so on just took an existing old translation as, for example, this, which had been circulating in printed form since the 1470s, and combined it with the existing translations by Luther. And the Wittenberg printer said, if you don't provide us with translations of the Apocrypha, we are losing out on business. So he grudgingly told his students to get working on the Apocrypha. He couldn't be bothered. He wrote a programmatic introduction to it saying, be careful, it's not canonical, but it's kind of devotional. So you might read it as you might read a devotional play. Just don't take it to be the truth. And so just to give you a flavor of the Bible translation style before Luther. So this is from a manuscript copy of the first printed Bible by Mentel. And, this is actually the book of Judas, so one of the Apocrypha. It is a very literal translation, because these translations weren't done really as a independent text on its own, but mainly to enable people to understand the authoritative Latin text. So they were more like crib sheets rather than an idiomatic German translation. The translated, for example, translated et evolvit corpus eius truncum, so and turned down his truncated body. So truncum is the adjective to corpus, but the translator didn't understand it, so translated truncum as a noun, und wälzet ab seinen Lieb, den Stamm, as a push down his body, the trunk, quasi, making it completely unintelligible if you don't know what he's getting at. Also, the translator didn't know quite a lot of the rarer words. So conopeum, for example, is a mosquito net, which is a hapac phlegomenon in there. And he just went for something that sounded similar. So he translated conopeum with Küsse, kissen, a cushion. And the effect is, you can see in the illustration, the illustrator takes the cushion cover to transport Holofernes' head, which is quite funny. So you see the blue and white striped cushion cover with the bloody head of Holofernes being carried away from it. So this is just as a background to why Luther's translation must have looked really startlingly different from what people were used to, because other than in England, it wasn't actually forbidden to translate the Bible. People could freely buy printed copies of the German Bible, but they really didn't cut mustard in that they weren't text to be immediately understood and engaged with. And I've put in the first full English Bible, which Miles Coverdale did based on the translation previously done by Tyndall, because he actually then relied on Luther's translation. So
Tyndall did or Coverdale?
Coverdale did. So Tyndall hadn't, it predates Luther, but Coverdale became keenly aware through things like the Sendbrief vom Dolmetschen, through pamphlets like an die Ratsherren deutscher Städte, dass sie Schulen errichten sollen, that it was really of paramount importance not to translate from Latin but from Greek and Hebrew. And he didn't have Greek and Hebrew. So what he did was he translated from the Vulgate, but used Luther's translation as a corrective. Since he understood German, particularly Low German, as if you were using a machine translation and then to correct another, or if you did a machine translation and then corrected it from a translation into a third language to make it philologically correct. So that is the time and place for the Sendbrief. You have to imagine Luther sitting on the Coburg, having been kind of exiled from Wittenberg, and trying to influence things happening in Augsburg by writing actually letters to Nuremberg, which was the best networked place through which the messengers and ambassadors to the Diet at Augsburg passed. So the Sendbrief is published with a preface by Wenceslaus Link, who at that point was Protestant minister in Nuremberg, and he had had a very similar career to Luther. He had also been an Augustinian friar, like Luther, became professor of theology in Wittenberg, and had then gone to Nuremberg when in 1525 the city voted, or the town council voted to adopt the Reformation, and became the first imperial city to be officially Protestant. And so this became the kind of Schaltzentrale for distributing Reformation publications, and obviously much closer than to Coburg than Wittenberg was. So it's just, yeah. Oh.
I think you just touched it.
Right, good. We are back. So, yeah, thanks for alerting me. If you have ever traveled by train from Nuremberg to Berlin, you will have passed first through Bamberg, and then Coburg is the next stop, and then Leipzig towards the north to Berlin. So Luther uses Wenceslaus Link as his kind of editor to send letters to publish it then. Nuremberg was so well connected that within a month it had been republished in Basel, in Wittenberg also, all over Germany in multiple copies. And he writes it, he dates it on the 15th of September, and that's the publication of the pamphlet, which is quite astonishing because we know that Luther had only sent off the manuscript on the 12th of September, which is faster than Royal Mail would deliver nowadays across the same distance. So Luther had asked him to pass it on to the best printer in Nuremberg, which was Georg Rottmeier, who had previously published. Luther was very keen on avoiding badly typeset stuff, particularly if you argue for philological correctness in your Bible translation, you also want your own writings to be über allen Tadel erhaben. So we have first the preface by Wenceslaus Link, who frames it, and then we have the letter as such, which starts with a dedication dem ehrbaren und fürsichtigen N, meinem günstigen Herrn und Freunde. Gnad und Friede in Christo, ehrbar, fürsichtiger, lieber Herr und Freund. Ich habe euer Schrift empfangen mit den 2 Questionen oder Fragen, darin ihr mein Berichts begehrt. Erstlich, warum ich zu den Römern am 3. Kapitel die Wort Sancti Pauli, arbitramur, hominem justificari ex fide abs quo operibus, also verdeutscht habe, wir halten, dass der Mensch gerecht werde ohne das Gesetzwerk, allein durch den Glauben, und zeigt daneben an, wie die Papisten sich über die Maßen unnütze machen, weil ihm der Text Pauli nicht steht, im Text Pauli nicht steht das Wort sola, allein, und sei solcher Zusatz von mir nicht zu leiden in Gottes Worten, etc. Zum anderen, ob auch die verstorbenen Heiligen für uns bitten, weil wir lesen, dass ja die Engel für uns bitten, etc. Auf die erste Frage, wo es euch gelüstet, mögt ihr euren Papisten von meinetwegen antworten. Also, man kommt zum ersten, the letter. And for a long time, actually, until 2 years ago, it was assumed that this N, to which, so nomen non datur, the anonymous addressee, was actually just a ruse of Luther to be able to employ the form of a letter. And when we prepared the second edition of the Sendbrief, Ulrich Bubenheimer went again through the papers of that time of the Nuremberg Town Council and realized that these apparently unconnected topics, translation and intercession of saints, are both in the Ratsprotokolle for that period. And the Ratsprotokolle were kept by Lazarus Spengler, a patrician himself who was the kind of like a registrar to the university, the main archivist. and that the form of address that Luther uses is exactly the right form of address you would use for high-level official, the kind of Beamtensprache. And as you know, for official letters, you have to get the titles and so on exactly right if you want your petition also to have the right impact. How you address an MP different from somebody in the House of Lords. So to know which form of address to use, there were so-called Titelbüchlein, which list exactly how to address each person. And Nuremberg is actually given as an example for an imperial town. And so how to address Bürgermeister und Räte, so the mayor and the town councillors, as den fürsichtigen, hochberühmten und weisen Bürgermeister und Rate der Stadt Nürnberg, meinem günstigen, lieben Herrn. And Luther follows exactly this type of Briefsteller that he should use for somebody like Lazarus Spengler. Ulrich Bubenheimer then had several further arguments for Spengler being the addressee. You can read that for yourself in the booklet. From forms of address of the town council and major, and so this and the structure, I'll now jump directly into the passage that I've also given you on the handout, where it's also how to address somebody properly, and in this case, how to create this kind of personal form of address, kind of a language of intimacy. I will just read you that part of the lecture. Item. So Luther has already discussed several of his translation principles, and now comes to his first major example. Item, da der Engel Mariam grüßet und spricht, gegrüßet seist du, Maria, voll Gnaden, der Herr mit dir. Wohlan, so ist's bisher, schlecht den lateinischen Buchstaben nach verdeutet. So schlecht means schlicht, simply. Sage mir aber, ob solches auch gut Deutsch sei. So, this gegrüßet seist du, Maria, voll Gnade goes back to this literal translation of Jerome's Bible version, Ave Maria Gratia Plena. So gratia and plena in that case as ablative, so full of grace. And then he disputes this and says, wo redet der Deutschmann also, du bist voll Gnaden? Und welcher Deutscher versteht, was gesagt sei, voll Gnaden? Er muss denken an ein Fass voll Bier oder Beutel voll Geldes. Darum hab ich's verdeutscht, du Holdselige, damit doch ein Deutscher desto mehr hinzu kann denken, was der Engel meinet mit seinem Gruß. So Luther argues that it's not following the grammatical construction of the source text, but following the sense, and that you have to consider the form of the kind of cloud of association each word has in your target language. So his argument is that the adjective full is related to liquids or to objects, and that so it's a kind of disrespectful actually to Mary to have her filled with a grace as a barrel is filled with beer or as a bag is filled with ducats, which is kind of true, but also not. What actually is annoying Luther is that this concept of being filled by something has even more the association of something static. So it's a state of being rather than an action. And this is something he wants to dissociate with any human being, even if it is Mary, because he wants grace as a mobile concept, something that is given constantly by Christ, but isn't in the possession, in der Verfügungsgewalt of any human being. And just to illustrate how the fullness was visualized in the Middle Ages, I've given you here a so-called Shrine Madonna, where you can open up the sculpture of Mary to reveal the Trinity within, because the concept of her being pregnant with Christ, being also pregnant with God, and so literally being filled with a grace. And this form of, and then remaining in this state of grace. And that is something he wants to dissociate with Mary, using a linguistic argument. And if you read further on through his translation of the New Testament, which is a good exercise, can only recommend it regardless whether it's for paper 4 or paper 3, just to get the hang of his periods, you'll see that he uses the formula voll von for Christ. So he doesn't object for Christ being voll Gnade. And there it suddenly isn't associated for him with strong liquors of ducats of gold. He continues, and there he certainly was right, aber hier wollen die Papisten toll werden über mich, dass ich den englischen Gruß verderbet habe. So another reason for him to pick this passage above all other passages is that he knew he would hit a really sore point with the Catholics and the Marian devotion by comparing Mary to a barrel of beer or a bag of ducats. He says, even though, wiewohl ich dennoch damit nicht das beste Deutsch, so, and he uses, he first suggests Schuldselige, and then he says, wiewohl ich dennoch damit nicht das beste Deutsch habe getroffen. Und hätte ich das beste Deutsch hier sollen nehmen und den Gruß also verdeutschen, Gott grüße dich, du liebe Maria. Denn so viel will der Engel sagen, und so würde er geredet haben, wann er hätte wollen, sie deutsch grüßen. Ich halte, sie sollten sich wohl selbst erhängt haben vor großer Andacht zu der lieben Maria, dass ich den Gruß so zunichte gemacht hätte. I've given you more or less, not quite contemporary, it's nearly 90 years earlier, but an Annunciation scene that shows this tendency of the late Middle Ages to actually take biblical scenes and put them in the here and now, in a kind of homely German setting. So Luther isn't the first to say, imagine the angel coming in, talking German to you. And you notice the angel is using the du, while Luther here, when addressing this singular N, whom he calls his Freund, he calls him, ich habe euer Schrift empfangen, so he uses ihr. It's again, it's a bit of fickle. So when he addresses Lazarus Spengler or whoever the addressee is, he uses the ihr rather than the du, but the angel is on this kind of really intimate conversation with Mary. In late medieval devotion, Gabriel is sometimes called the paranymphus in Latin. Paranymphus is a Greek word. It's the best man or Brautwerber. So God is sending Gabriel to ask for the hand of Mary in a way, and using this familiar duo. Aber was frage ich danach? Sie toben oder rasen, ich will nicht wehren, dass sie verdeutschen, was sie wollen. Ich will aber auch verdeutschen, nicht wie sie wollen, sondern wie ich will. Wer es nicht haben will, der lass mir es stehen und halt seine Meisterschaft bei sich. Denn ich will ihr weder sehen noch hören. Sie dürfen für mein Dolmetschen nicht Antwort geben, noch Rechenschaft tun. Das hörst du wohl. Ich will sagen, du holdselige Maria, du liebe Maria. Und lass sie sagen, du voll Gnaden Maria. Wer Deutsch kann, der weiß wohl, welch ein herzlich fein Wort das ist. Die liebe Maria, der lieb Gott, der liebe Kaiser, der liebe Fürst, der liebe Mann, das liebe Kind. So that's again back to how to address somebody properly. Und ich weiß nicht, ob man das Wort Liebe auch so herzlich und genugsam in lateinischer oder anderen Sprachen reden mög, das also dringe und klinge ins Herz durch alle Sinne, wie es tut in unserer Sprache. So he gets nearly lyrical and trying to show poetic language associated with this instead. So he argues that this should be seen as like a love song rather than like a formal theological treatise. Denn ich halte St. Lukas als ein Meister in hebräischer und griechischer Sprache, hab das hebräische Wort, so der Engel gebraucht wollen, mit dem griechischen kecharitomene treffen und deutlich geben. I don't have really time to go into kecharitomene. Have a look through the handout and look at different versions used to analyze this, which is a very complex word. It has as core element charis, which is actually grace. And in the line before that, what is used as ave in Latin is chaire in Greek. So it's a wordplay which actually goes back to Aramaic practice of so-called figura etymologica, that you use the same root word in different formations to play around a meaning. So it's grace to you, graceful one, in a way. In which theological direction you take it, I'll leave you. I can also recommend looking at, I've given you the link there, at the Bibel in gerechter Sprache and their discussion of how to do a gender appropriate form of address, where God in this passage is referred to with a feminine form. And you have a glossary. But time is up, so just to sum up 4 ideas in which Luther's Sendbrief became really formative, in that he talks about translation as a process, as something that has to be done in every generation, for every audience, anew, and to think about the translation choice is never just a pragmatic one, it always implies a programmatic choice. Philology and politics are always linked, so translation is never neutral, and you can't do social linguistics without having a firm grounding in historical linguistics. So much for paper 4 as a core paper for German studies. So see you all again in 2 weeks for forms of address continued in early modern period in this room with Malena Ratzke. Right. Thank you.